video. So we're on the second video for this lecture, and this is the first ANOVA lecture. And during this lecture, what I really want to focus on is a much more limited scope. Even though it says 50 minutes, it won't take 50 minutes to go through this material. There are 2 points that I want to make. And that is, there's a philosophy that differentiates analysis of variance and MRC. And that philosophy is very helpful for most students to be able to understand the ideas that are encapsulated in both of these methods and what's unique to each one of them in the general linear model. So the philosophy is such that there can be two views. There are actually a lot of views in the world, but there are two views that really encapsulate ANOVA and MRC, and that is Platonic essentialism and Aristotelian nominalism. So Plato is to ANOVA as Aristotle is to MRC. So you need to remember that. And the reason why you remember that is it will help you understand the logic and the way errors or residuals are viewed. So I'm going to deal with them one at a time. First, to distinguish between these two, Platonic essentialism is very simple. It is that there exists some ideal in the world. And that ideal, and it might actually not be in the world, it may only be according to Omniscient Jones. And so if I have a class of people who are taking a drug, there is a perfect class of individual taking that drug. However, that perfect person taking that drug doesn't exist. Everybody is kind of contains the essence of that real person, but they are an imperfect representation of that perfect person. And that essentialism is such that when we view individuals, especially when we view individuals within a group, we say those individuals are best characterized by their group membership, but the individuals within that group are all imperfect. So there's a lot of error within that group of reflecting what that essential element is of that group composition. Contrast that with Aristotelian nominalism, where Aristotle was a big fan of identifying differences and classifying individuals or of all kinds based upon their differences and similarities. So if there are drug seekers or drug takers here, if there are drug takers in this group, because you've been assigned a group to take a drug, when you get assigned that group, the fact that you take the drug or not is an important variable, not just your assignment to that group. Because while you've been assigned to that group, you're also an individual. And your individualness will lead you to stray from the pack for all sorts of reasons. You may take too many pills at one time, or maybe not take any, you'll forget. So all of that is what in MRC we label as residual. It's unaccounted for. It's important because it's what really matters in many ways, but it's unaccounted for in our modeling. So the philosophy behind ANOVA and MRC is such that ANOVA follows the Platonic essentialist view that when there are individuals within a group, the group matters more than the individual deviations. And so therefore, individuals who deviate within that group actually increase the amount of noise and are labeled as error. Okay? Now, those observations are error. Contrast that with Aristotelian nominalism that's more akin to the application of MRC, where individuals may have been assigned to a group, but their deviation within the group is important and interesting and useful. And so what we label that as residual. That's where our model breaks down. So in ANOVA, the errors are in the observation. They're attributable to the observation. In MRC, the errors are attributable to the omission of a relevant variable that would account for those deviations. So that's the reason why in MRC we say residuals, and in ANOVA we say error. Now, that is just a philosophical difference, but I want to talk more about the concrete similarities and differences, because here's where you're going to start seeing a lot of the overlap, and you'll also see why the general linear model is the best way of understanding and summarizing both ANOVA and MRC. So first, the similarities. As I mentioned before, there are similar assumptions that underlie these models, because the assumptions are part of the general linear model. And in the previous video, I talked about errors are IID. And that's an easy way for you to think about what it is to, what the assumptions are in the general linear model for both ANOVA and multiple regression. Next is, both of them offer hypothesis tests. They offer both omnibus tests and simple effects. Now, the omnibus test in regression comes from testing whether the whole model performs adequately enough to decrease our uncertainty, which is account for a sufficient amount of variability in our dependent variable to lead to reasonable predictions. Okay, that's the omnibus. Remember, as I said in ANOVA, the omnibus is any time that you have a full model, you're going to get F tests that are associated with each factor, and you'll also get an overall F, whether all these factors account for something. Generally speaking, though, the omnibus lies at the factor level, especially if you have a factor with multiple levels and more levels than just simply 2. You can get simple effects in both ANOVA and MRC. In ANOVA, the simple effects are pretty straightforward, and they come about from the t-statistics. Similarly, you can get simple effects in ANOVA by testing post hocs. Or if you only have 2 levels of your factor, the simple effect is present in the F test. Next is, because both of these are part of the general linear model, they require linear, and that is additive. Remember plus signs. They require linear effects. Okay? And then finally, the similarities are everything that we do in statistics is about understanding variance. So it doesn't matter whether variance is in the name of analysis of variance or hidden, not in the name of multiple regression. Both of them focus on explaining variability. That's the similarity. And that's where they all fit underneath the general linear model. Now, how do they differ? Generally speaking, MRC and ANOVA differ with respect to the types of predictors. In analysis of variance, we have factors. In multiple regression, we have covariates, but we can also have factors. So we can have class-level variables and covariates in MRC. In ANOVA, we can only have class level variables. Now, some people may argue that you can run an ANOVA, so analysis of covariance. But the problem with that is that analysis of covariance is nothing more than a multiple regression that's run on the covariates first, and then the factors come in second to predict or to analyze the variability of the residuals after the covariates have been accounted for. So ANOVA is really a marriage of ANOVA and MRC. So that would be cheating. ANOVA is restricted to factors, and ANOVA doesn't really handle violations of certain assumptions like homogeneity of variances. Typically, we have a rule of thumb about it's not just homogeneity of variances, but a relatively equivalent distribution of experimental units in every cell. Because as soon as you deviate from the same number of experimental observations per cell, your variability changes. So that's a big issue. And correcting for it becomes a nasty endeavor. Multiple regression and correlation models, MRC models don't require the same balance that ANOVA does. Because of that, there are some differences in diagnostics, and with MRC, the focus is solely on the residuals. There are instances in which residuals are only a part of it, but for the most part, the residuals are the focus. With ANOVA, we also focus on the balance of the design. We focus on also the residuals, but we look at the observed variability. We look at a lot of different factors to diagnose whether ANOVA models are defensible. Finally, the differences lie, just as I said before, between the variability of variance is key, but the variability now, we look at individuals for MRC, and we look at group variability for ANOVA. So the focus is somewhat different in that in multiple regression models, we're really looking at individual observations. In analysis of variance, we're looking at groups or class level variables. And therein lies the difference and the similarities between these two members of the general linear model.